I'm going to show you how to mass reboot VMs. Let's get started. Hi everyone, I'm Radbug from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environment, you're in the right place. Start now by subscribing and click the bell so that you don't miss a thing. The VVork recording studio is temporarily dismantled during construction, so I, Radbug, will be leading today's video. Let me show you how to mass reboot VMs.
Apologies, I have a frog in my throat. VVork subscriber Ramzanye8769 asked whether I could create a workflow that could do a mass reboot of multiple VMs. Well, my initial thought was I could be a smart aleck and just say yes, but it seems to me that it'd be more useful if I actually created such a workflow and talked about it and showed you how it works. So that's what we're going to do in this video. This simple workflow is all it takes to reboot every single virtual machine in your entire environment. In other words, this simple workflow will reboot all the VMs on every host, in every cluster, in every data center, across all of your vCenter servers. And as you can see from the flashing message here, that's quite dangerous. So you wouldn't want to run this particular workflow, especially in a production environment. But let's go ahead and take a look at how this workflow works. At the beginning of the workflow, we have our start schema element, followed by an action called get all VMs. That action, as its name suggests, will go out and find every single virtual machine throughout your entire infrastructure. And that action will return all those VMs as an array of virtual machines. Or to be more specific, it'll return an array of VC:virtual machine objects. So the action produces an array of virtual machines, and then through the magic of binding, we feed that array of virtual machines into the next schema element. This schema element is going to call a single workflow multiple times. As you can see from this little icon here, this is the for each schema element. It doesn't just call the workflow we specify once, it calls it multiple times. In this case here, it will call reboot guest OS once for every virtual machine in that array. Now, one thing about this workflow that makes it exceptionally dangerous is the action itself. Again, if you get a list of all the VMs and you power them all off or you reboot them, that's obviously going to be pretty disruptive in your work environment and could be a career limiting move. So we want to be careful. But let's take a look at some other actions. They're similar actions, but they won't return as many virtual machines. So let's go take a look at these actions in the lab environment. All right, let's close this workflow and let's go to Library Actions. And in here, we've got loads and loads of different actions. Let's search for get all VMs. Now, not only is this going to find the action I just showed you, it's also going to find any other actions that have a similar name. So the action I just showed you was called get all VMs, but you'll notice we have a bunch of other actions. Almost every single one of these is included with Orchestrator. The one exception is this one here called get all VMs of folder. That's one I created myself. I'm not certain why we don't supply one to get all the virtual machines from a VM folder, but I went ahead and created that for you. By the way, if you take a look at the YouTube description, you can find information about how you can download this action plus the workflows I'm showing you from my GitLab source code repository. Again, take a look at the YouTube description for that information. So every single one of these actions is designed to return an array of VC:virtual machine objects. In the case of the first action that we looked at, get all VMs will return a potentially massive array with every single virtual machine in your entire infrastructure. All these other actions will also return an array of virtual machine objects, but they will return a smaller subset. So for example, if I wanted to, I could call this action to get an array of all the virtual machines in a particular virtual machine folder. Or maybe you want to get all the virtual machines from a data center. Or maybe you want an array of all the virtual machines from a particular cluster, or running on a particular host, or stored in a particular data store. Or maybe you use resource pools and you want an array of all the virtual machines in a particular resource pool. Or if you know what regular expressions are, you can use those to filter down and pick exactly the virtual machines you want in the array. Or you can say, I want all the virtual machines in a particular cluster, or I want an array of all the virtual machines in a VM. These actions are actually remarkably straightforward. For example, let's look at the code involved in getting all the virtual machines from your entire environment. So we'll open up Get All VMs. Let's go to the Script tab. And as I said before, each of these actions returns an array of virtual machines. Now, in the case of Get All VMs, this is the entirety of the code. It simply returns whatever gets returned by this method called VC plugin. That's the vCenter Server plugin in Orchestrator. And it has a method called Get All Virtual Machines. On the other hand, if we look at some of the other actions, such as the one that I wrote, when you look at the code there, look at its script, again, it's still returning the same type, but this one works a little differently. One thing that's different about this action is that it needs an input. It needs to know which VM folder you want us to look into and return the VMs in that folder as an array. So I've defined here an input to this action called VM folder. It's asking whoever runs this action to pick one virtual machine folder. And what it does with that is that feeds that into a method called Get All Virtual Machines by folder, including subfolders. Again, that's defined in the vCenter plugin itself. So there's very little code here because the magic is actually taking place in the vCenter plugin itself. So if you'd like to, feel free to open up each of these actions and take a look at their code. And if you'd like to, you can do as I did. I actually created a new action based on what I saw going on in others. In fact, I used Get All VMs of Data Center as the foundation of creating this new action called Get All VMs of Folder. So again, feel free to take a look at the code. All right, if you haven't already figured this out from the blinking skull and crossbones, this particular workflow is potentially astoundingly dangerous. You could unintentionally power off, not actually permanently power off, but in a reboot, there will be a period of time when the virtual machines are down. If you do that to all the virtual machines in your entire corporate environment, that's going to be bad all around. So let's talk about some things you could do to create a workflow that would be less dangerous. Well, the first thing that you could do that you've probably already figured out is that you could replace this action called Get All VMs with one of the other actions that I just showed you. In particular, you could use the Get All VMs of Folder action that I created. That way you could make certain that the VMs that are getting rebooted when you run this workflow would only be VMs in a particular folder. You'll see me doing that coming up here shortly in this video. But there's more than that we can do to create a safer, more robust workflow. So let's go back to the lab environment and see what else we could do. The dangerous workflow that I started showing you initially is this workflow here. We're going to take a look at a different workflow called rebooter. So let's open up rebooter. As its name suggests, the point of rebooter is to reboot whatever virtual machines we feed into this workflow. So to start off with, let's notice that we've defined one input called virtual machines. That's an array of VC virtual machines, which is exactly what we need if we want to start rebooting VMs. Let's take a look at the schema for this workflow. As you can see, there's much more going on in this workflow. You could do this more simply. You could do this more complicated. This is the workflow that I created to give me the opportunity to explain some points. So I'll leave it to you to decide exactly how you'd want to implement this. But notice that at the beginning of this particular workflow, the first thing that I do in this scriptable task is to copy that array of virtual machines from the input that we received into a variable. Now let me show you specifically what I'm doing here. This input called virtual machines is exactly what we want. It's an array of vSQL and virtual machines. The challenge here, though, is that that is an input, which means it's read-only, and I can never change that array. Now, as you'll see later on, there is one reason why I'm going to want to change that array, but I cannot do that with this if it's an input. So what this first schema element is doing is it's going to copy that input called virtual machines, and it's going to copy it to a variable called VMs, which you'll notice is also an array of vSQL and virtual machines. But because this is a variable, and because variables are read-write, I will be able to change the contents of this array. All right, so now we know what's going on in this first schema element. The second schema element uses something called a user interaction. That's what the little person icon represents, a user interaction. User interactions, which by the way, we can see over here in our palette of schema elements. User interactions can be used for a variety of purposes, but one of the main things that user interactions get used for is to implement approvals. So instead of just blindly taking the array of virtual machines and rebooting them all, what if we were to prompt the person running this workflow, are you sure you want to do this? Well, that's exactly what the user interaction is going to do here. And you'll see what that looks like here in a moment. But it's basically just a are you sure prompt that the operator is going to see, and they can decide whether they want to proceed or not. If they say that they don't want to proceed, that's what this decision is. We're looking at the response from the user. If they said they don't approve of the reboots that we're about to do, then we'll just go down this path and we won't reboot any virtual machines at all. On the other hand, if the person running this workflow says, yes, I do approve of rebooting the virtual machines, then we'll leave this decision down the green arrow to this scriptable task called log rebooting. If we take a look at that scriptable task, all that scriptable task is doing is saying a little message in our log so that we know that we went down this path. So if we go down this path, the log's going to say rebooting VMs, hope your resume is up to date. Because again, what we're about to do here could get a little dangerous. On the other hand, if the operator said don't reboot the virtual machines, it says you played it safe, you're not rebooting any VMs, have a nice day. All right, now things get a little interesting. This decision here is the beginning of a loop that we're going to go through. If you follow these arrows, here, you'll notice that there's, in fact, there's actually multiple loops here, but this is in effect one giant loop. Each time we go through the loop, we're going to look at one of the virtual machines that we received in the array. If we have gone through all the virtual machines, we will go down this path and we'll end the workflow. On the other hand, if there are still more virtual machines to be processed, if that array of VMs hasn't been completely consumed, what we're going to do each time we go through the loop is we're going to get one virtual machine from the array. Let's take a look at how we do that. So we take the VMs array. Remember, this is the variable, not the input. This is the variable. We take that as input, and what we want to do is take one of the VMs out of the VMs array and stick it into this other variable called VM. Now, to be real clear here, VMs is an array of virtual machines, so it's all the virtual machines. VM is another variable that we're going to use to hold one VM at a time. In other words, we'll go through this array. Each time we'll populate VM with one VM, and that's the VM that we're going to reboot. Now you may notice something interesting here. I've set up the VMs array as both an input and an output. Having it as an input is going to allow me to see what's in the array of VMs, and the output binding is going to allow me to change what's in the array of VMs. The fact that we need to change the value of the VMs array is why we did the copy to variable initially. Okay, but ignoring that for right now, we're taking in the array of VMs and we're going to get one VM from the array. Let's take a look at the super sophisticated code that does that. So we click on scripting, and it's actually just line number 1. VM, so the single VM that we're getting out of the array, is received by doing a vms.pop. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the concept of a stack, in JavaScript, you can treat an array like a stack. So we're popping one VM off of the array. If you don't know what a stack is a data structure in the programming world that allows you to push one item on at a time, and you can pop one item at a time. So VM equals vms.pop says I want to remove one of the VMs from the VMs array and put that VM into the variable called VM. And as a side effect of doing this, not only does the VM variable now hold a new VM, the array of virtual machines now has one less virtual machine in that array. Again, if you don't know what stacks are, go Google, search for tutorial on stacks. They're very, very useful. As an alternative to using a stack, for those of you who are familiar with the concept of having a counter variable, I could have used a counter variable to index into the array, in which case I would not have needed to set up VMs as a variable. I could have just used it as an input. On the other hand, if I'm using a counter variable, that's another variable I have to keep track of. All right, so after running through this scriptable task, we now have a variable called VM that's holding one VM. And what we're going to do in these next 3 decisions is to respond slightly differently depending upon what the current power state is of the virtual machine. If the VM is powered on, then we're going to call a standard workflow called reboot guest OS, which, as its name suggests, is going to reboot that guest OS. If the VM's powered on, we can reboot it. On the other hand, what if the VM was powered off? Well, if the VM was powered off, we can't really reboot it because it's not powered on, but we could power on that VM. Again, power on VM is another standard workflow. Third possible power state is that the virtual machine is suspended. If the virtual machine is suspended, then instead of powering it on or rebooting it, if it's suspended, we could resume the virtual machine, and maybe to truly make certain that it rebooted, we could call reboot guest OS. You could have opted to leave this out. Maybe you would consider resuming that virtual machine is enough of a reboot. Same sort of thing with this power on VM. If you wanted to, you could have followed a power on VM with a call to reboot guest OS. So totally up to you. If we go through all these decisions and we haven't matched power on state or powered off state or suspend state, then we're seeing some wacko unknown power state, in which case this scriptable task here will spit out some error messages into our logs, and it'll set an error code, unknown power state, that gets passed to this schema element, which would cause our workflow to throw an exception and stop running. All right, so what else do we have going on here? Let me pick apart one of these decision schema elements. Again, we've got 1, 2, 3 of them here looking at the different possible power states. If I show you one, you can open up the others and see how they're working. They're very similar. So if we open up this decision's asking whether the VM that we're currently looking at is already powered on. Again, if it is already powered on, we're going to reboot it. But how do we know if the VM is powered on? Well, to determine whether the VM is powered on, let's bring in the virtual machine. So we're setting up a inward binding to that variable we created called VM. And down here in the decision section, we have some fairly straightforward code. The decision is going to return true if, when we go looking in the VM variable, when we look at its runtime property, from there look at the power state property, from there look at the value. If the value of the power state of that virtual machine is the string powered on, then this code, this one line of code, would return true. On the other hand, if the power state is not equal to powered on, then this code would return false, and we would follow the red arrow. So if the VM is powered on, this returns true. We follow the green arrow. If this VM is powered off, this code here returns false, and we would go down the red path. Again, please feel free to open up these other two schema elements to see exactly how they're working. By the way, whenever you have something like a decision, where you're just testing for different values, that's actually a really good opportunity to use something called a switch statement. All right, so that's a pretty quick little run through on how this workflow works. Why don't we actually run it? So I'm going to run the workflow, and as a reminder, remember when we run this workflow, it's going to ask us to feed in an array of vSQL and virtual machine objects. So let's actually run the workflow. And again, since we human beings are running this workflow directly, we're being prompted to select what virtual machines we want to feed into our rebooter workflow. Now, in order to see what our choices are, let's go over here to the vSphere client and take a look at all these lovely virtual machines. Now, I don't want to reboot some of these virtual machines, such as these VMs that you see here in the folder called VCLS. These are infrastructure virtual machines that are managing the vCenter cluster services. I don't want to reboot those. And I may have some other virtual machines like this GitLab server and these Kubernetes servers and this Log Insight server and this VROP server and these NSX servers. I don't want those to reboot. Again, all of these essentially are infrastructure VMs, and I want to make certain that I don't reboot those. So what we could do here is, one way or another, we could just feed in some of these virtual machines. Now, not just yet, but shortly here, I'll show you how to use that action I created called get all VMs of folder, and we'll tell it get the VMs from this folder, and it'll just feed in these 4 VMs. But for right now, let's ignore that business of using an action to create the array of virtual machines. Let's pretend like those actions don't exist. All right, so what I'm going to do here is we're going to run the workflow, and we're just going to pick these 4 virtual machines. To make this a little more interesting, I'm going to, why don't we power off the VM called VMW-ENG-3903 has got powered off. I'm going to take the next one, so 3923, we're going to suspend it, and then we'll leave the other 2 virtual machines powered on. Did that work? That didn't look like that worked. Let me try that again. Power, suspend. There we go. Do I want to suspend? Yes, I want to suspend. Okay, so don't worry about all these other virtual machines. We are just going to focus on these 4 virtual machines. One's powered off, one's suspended, and the other 2 are powered on. But we want to reboot all of them. So let's go back to Orchestrator, to our rebooter workflow. And here I'm going to type the name of the virtual machine or virtual machines that I want to reboot. Now, if I type something like VCLS, that's going to find all those VCLS virtual machines that I don't want to reboot. So no, let's not do that. Let's slightly change this here to VMW. There we go. That matched all 4 of them. And if I wanted to, I could pick them one at a time. So here's the first VM. I could do that again to find the next one and the next one, but there's an easier way here. I'm going to type VMW. Again, that's going to match all of these 4 virtual machines. And instead of picking them one at a time, if you click on Show All, and you can either select them individually, or if you click the checkbox on top, it will select all 4. Again, remember this VM's powered off, this VM's suspended, and these 2 in the middle are powered on. So let's click Select. You can see all the virtual machines that are about to get rebooted right here. Let's click Run. And remember, we've got this user interaction in our workflow. After copying the virtual machine's input to the variable called VMs, our workflow has automatically paused here, awaiting a response from whoever's running this workflow. So there are different ways you can set up user interactions. I've set up this user interaction to prompt me right here as I'm running this workflow. So it's asking me, are you sure you want to do this? Well, let's go answer that question. So I'll click on answer. And again, it asks you, are you sure you want to do this? If I leave this Boolean checkbox unchecked, that means I don't approve. I reject this request. On the other hand, if I select this checkbox, that means I approve of this request. Let's click answer, and the workflow starts running. By the way, as it flip-flops back and forth in the diagrams here, that's because we're calling different workflows. As an orchestrator workflow calls other workflows, which call other workflows, the diagram's going to change here as we flip-flop between them. If you want to follow what's happening, follow the breadcrumb trail here. So rebooter is my workflow, and it's calling other workflows such as a standard workflow called start virtual machine and wait. By the way, the reason why we're waiting here, this workflow waits until the virtual machine powers on and VMware Tools is up and running. But as you can see, it's continuing to go through the process of rebooting all the virtual machines. And if we take a look at our logs here, please feel free to look at this in more detail on your own. Again, go to the YouTube description down below and you can see how to go to my GitLab source code repository to down this workflow and other goodies. But when you run this workflow, the logging that's going on here is showing us exactly what's going on. So it tells us which virtual machines, tells us what their initial power state was, and if this all worked, it will complete successfully, as opposed to failed. This completed successfully, and if we go over to the vSphere client, we can see that all 4 of those virtual machines are powered on. And if you want to go reading through the recent task section, you can see exactly the steps we went through. So some of the virtual machines we rebooted, we resumed, and so forth. Again, all the information, if you really want to follow this, is in here. Take a look at the recent tasks and or take a look at the log in Orchestrator, and you should get a good feel for exactly how this workflow works. All right, now you've met my rebooter workflow. Now, I intentionally designed things this way. I intentionally set up rebooter to be a separate workflow that focuses just on the act of rebooting a virtual machine. By modularizing the workflow that way, I can call that rebooter workflow from lots of other workflows, including we're just about to create a workflow called mass VM extinction. Silly name, but the point of this workflow is it's going to ask the user who runs this workflow to feed in the virtual machines that they want rebooted. Now, we're going to have some design decisions to make here in a few moments. Do we want to reboot the virtual machines from a particular VM folder, or the VMs on a particular host, or in a particular cluster? Again, we know that there are actions that we can use to simplify that process. But let's go ahead and open up this workflow called mass VM extinction. I've already started the process, but as you can see, there's not much going on. In fact, the schema is empty. So what we're going to do in this workflow is ultimately this workflow is going to call the rebooter workflow. But first, we need to create the array of VMs that we want to reboot. So let's do that by making use of our actions. So I'm going to drag in an action. And again, I could choose to call the action called get all VMs or get all VMs. Tell you what, let's start typing some of this here. Get all VMs of vApp, or of compute resource, or of resource pool, or the one I created was called get all VMs of folder. Let's go ahead and choose that one. Now notice, for this action to work, we need to feed in a VM folder. We're going to ask the user to pick which VM folder. And the action in return will return us an output, specifically an array of vC:n virtual machines. So we need to ask the end user, the person who's running this workflow, to pick a VM folder. Now we can do this a variety of different ways. We could go to the Inputs tab and create a new input, or we can shortcut this here by going to Select Variable. We'll create a new input, which is the same thing as going to this tab. We're going to create a new input, And why don't we call this input VM folder, because we want the user to pick a VM folder. So pick a VM folder, and we will reboot the VMs in that folder. All right, so we now have actually it says we have a variable. We don't want that. We want an input because we want to ask the user who's calling this workflow to pick the VM folder. So we're going to feed in whichever VM folder the user selects. This action's going to return an array of vC:colon virtual machines, but we need some place to store that. So why don't we create another, in this case, variable called something exciting like virtual machines. Now you'll notice the default name is action result. That's the default name for the variable returned by all actions, but we always want to change that. So we're going to change this to something else like virtual machines. Let's type a quick description for this. So this is an array of the VMs to be rebooted. And while we could set a value for this variable, we're not going to bother pre-assigning a value because the action is actually going to set the value. So we're going to call get all VMs from folder. We're going to pass in whichever VM folder the user running this workflow selected, and the action is going to return an array of virtual machine objects into this variable called virtual machines. Now all that's left to do is to use a workflow element to call our rebooter workflow. It requires an input. It needs to be fed in an array of virtual machine objects. And as you can see, it has automatically set up a binding to that variable that we just created. So in some cases, you'll need to manually set up the binding, but here it figured out based on the types of variables exactly what was needed. Again, if this wasn't populated here, if it hadn't automatically selected that, you could simply click on select variable, pick virtual machines, and now we've got the binding necessary to feed the array of virtual machines that the action is creating and feed that array of virtual machines into the rebooter. All right, let's go ahead and save this workflow and confirm the save. And let's actually run it. Now, remember, we've got these virtual machines over here. Once again, why don't we power off this virtual machine, and we will suspend this other virtual machine. We'll give them a few moments to do that. We'll go back to our workflow, and we're going to run the workflow. Since we asked the user to pick a VM folder, they're going to pick a VM folder. In this case here, we're using the tree browser to pick it. And right here is the VM folder that holds those 4 virtual machines. We'll select it. We'll click Run. Again, when this workflow runs, it asks us to confirm, so we're going to answer. We'll select Yes, we approve. We click Answer. And now our workflow is magically going out and rebooting all 4 of those virtual machines from that VM folder.